Good afternoon, good morning for those who are following us from the United States, and welcome to this discussion on European foreign policy. I am joined here today by colleagues of mine, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to be speaking. So we will start with Francesco Siccardi, who is a senior program manager here at Carnegie Europe, and then we'll move on to Stefan Lehne, who's a visiting scholar here at Carnegie Europe after a long career in the Austrian diplomacy and many years served in EU institutions in working on foreign policy. Now, together, Francesco and Stefan wrote a paper entitled "Where in the World is the EU Now?", which really tries to dissect empirically what European Union global engagement has looked like over the past 5 years. So it's covering the previous institutional stint with the European Commission when the High Representative was Federica Mogherini, and European action on the global scene more broadly. We are joined in this discussion, and I'm very grateful for her time, by Anu Bradford, who is the director of the European Legal Studies Center at Columbia Law School, and also a non-resident scholar with Carnegie. Anu is also the author of a book entitled "The Brussels Effect" on how the European Union rules the world. So it's a slightly different take to what is now the sort of current debate on geopolitics and how European Union is divided and its foreign policy objectives. So I don't want to take any more time. I'd just like to remind our listeners that they can submit questions on the YouTube channel or via Twitter, and so that we can have a nice debate after the presentations and opening remarks from our speakers. So I'd like to pass the floor to Francesco, please.
Thank you, Rosa. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you, Stefan, Anu, and with our audience. You introduced the paper, and I'll expand a little bit more on the findings of our research. And in the next 10 to 12 minutes, I'll basically do three things. I'll give an idea of the methodology that we used, and then I'll pull up some charts and maps to show you the two main trend lines that Stefan and I identified across the data that we looked at. The first one, that, as you rightly said, the EU has a strong global engagement across the planet throughout all the continents, but it remains heavily anchored to its immediate neighbors, and then that there have been degrees of continuity and discontinuity in the last 10 years, from the second Barroso Commission from 2010 to 2014, and then continuing to the Juncker Commission 2014 to 2019. So I'll be showing some numbers and figures to give you an idea of where we think that went, and possibly tease out some ideas about the future. Now, about the study that Stefan and I produced, the thing to know is that we just didn't come up with an analytical framework in 2019 when we started drafting it, but this is based off a research that Stefan had conducted back in 2015 when, together with another colleague at Carnegie, he had produced an empirical analysis of the second Barroso Commission and the HRVP term of Catherine Ashton. Now, in 2019, 10 years after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, we thought that it would be very interesting to replicate this analysis, not just to get an idea of how the Mogherini term went, but also to get a set of results that we could compare against the performance of the Barroso Commission to identify the different trends. Now, the indicators we looked at are 9. We divided them in two broad categories. The first one is one that we consider like traditional tools of EU foreign policy as it's done by its leaders. We looked at the visits of the EU leaders President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, the HRVP, Federica Mogherini, and the President of the Council, Donald Tusk. We tracked the topics that the HRVP mentions and discusses in over 1,000 declarations that she released over the course of its tenure. And then we counted the foreign policy references and references to third countries across the body of European Council conclusion documents and Foreign Affairs Council conclusion documents. And then we turn our attention to a more technical set of instruments, instrument of external engagement. We dubbed them. These are sanctions, civilians and military operations, EU assistance, EU trade agreements, the size of EU delegations, and the deployment of EU special representatives. Now, let me pull up my first map. The first thing I want to show you to get across my first point. Now, this is a map of EU trade of the countries with which the EU has currently trade agreements or is negotiating one or has a provisional trade agreement in place. And the first point, I decided to start from here just to show that this is a policy area in which the EU certainly has a global outreach. This is also, and to an extent surprisingly so, an area of continuity of policy in the last 10 years, from the Barroso Second Commission to the Juncker Commission. We all remember that trade was somehow a heated debate in not just because of Trump's trade wars, but we all remember the negotiations of TTIP and all of the debate that generated, the ratification of the Canada Agreement, and the effects, the results of the Dutch referendum on the Ukraine agreement. Despite all this, the EU was able, the European Commission was able to conclude 6 trade agreements in this period with Canada, Mexico, Southern African countries, and then in Asia, Singapore, Vietnam, and Japan, and with Australia and Mercosur countries next in line. And in continuity with the Barroso Commission, one element that stood out to us was that the two commissions started the same number of negotiations. It was 12 apiece, both on behalf of the Barroso Commission and the Juncker Commission. So a first area of continuity. And then moving on, another element of global outreach of EU foreign policy is certainly EU assistance. But here is interesting, or one interesting feature is that we can start to see the focus on neighboring regions. And the first thing to say is that sub-Saharan African countries are where and remain where and are the main destination of EU assistance. The total share was 44% in 2013, which is the data set that Stefan used 5 years ago in his first study. And it went down to 38% in 2018, despite the volume of disbursement having increased by 15%. Now, why is that? This is, of course, because following the crisis in Syria and then the refugee crisis, disbursements to Turkey and Syria went up considerably. Particularly Syria went from 80 million in 2013 to 483 in 2018. Now, if we look at the top 5 countries receivers of EU assistance, they're all very close to EU borders. They're Ukraine, Turkey, Syria, the West Bank and Gaza, and then a little further east, we have Afghanistan. And if we look at a different way to conceptualize the data, and we look at the per capita indicators, then we are even closer to the EU borders. In Western Balkans, we have North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Kosovo, and Georgia in the Caucasus, and then again, the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the Middle East. Now, if there is nothing I'd like more than show you how these patterns are repeated across other indicators, be it sanctions, the size of EU delegations, or the deployment of EU special representatives. But time is limited. So what I'd like to show you instead is another area of global engagement, which is the references to foreign policy and third countries in European Council and Foreign Affairs Council conclusions. Now here what we did is we took the 21 conclusion documents of the 21 European Councils of the past 5 years, the 74 we looked at 74 Foreign Affairs Council conclusions, and as you can see, the attention of EU leaders was quite broad. Really a lot of countries in shades of blue. But if we look at the darker shades, we see that they're all not too far from the borders of the EU. The most discussed topics in this 5 years, the one that pops out most frequently was migration, probably unsurprisingly. But if we look at the top 15, then it all goes back to crisis in the neighborhood, be it Ukraine, Libya, or Syria, Brexit, which was virtually in every council conclusion from June 2016 onward, Bosnia, ISIS, and Turkey. The highest ranking non-neighborhood related topic was climate change, which is interesting, and it was followed by Venezuela, Iran, trade, Central African Republic, and North Korea. Now, if this gives an empirical indication of a global outreach, but a focus on immediate neighbors, what is interesting is to put this data into historical perspective, and which is what draws me to my conclusion for now, and to this last slide. Here we see the incidence of neighboring countries across periods, February 2010 to October 2014, and November 2014 to November 2019, across 3 indicators: the visits of top EU officials, declarations of the HRVP, and council conclusions. And if you look at these blue bars that should have just turned red, these are the share of the attention that the EU dedicates to the neighborhood. You can see by yourself that the neighbors remain the focus of they get the relative majority of the attention, but in a decreasing way. Visits of top EU officials were down to 44% from 51%. Declaration of the HRVP paid attention to neighborhood countries in just 42% of cases against 56% of the Barroso Commission, and then Council conclusion in 2010 to 2014 dedicated 55% of their conclusions to neighborhood countries, and the figure is down to 44% in the last 5 years, which in a way leaves us with a question which I'll modestly try to give an answer to, which is where does this attention go? It goes to Asia and the Gulf, certainly. The visits to this region have increased from 23 to 25%, despite an overall reduction of official travel of EU officials by 10%. It goes to Sub-Saharan Africa, which was vastly more covered by declarations of the HRVP. You see it's up from 14 to 22%, and it went to Central and South America, a continent which was ignored in the European Council conclusions from 2010 to 2014, and then that came back on the table probably because of the Venezuela crisis, and also because of the migration crisis between Colombia and Brazil, and then through Mexico and toward the United States. I'll pause here for now. I hope the 2 trending lines that I described at the beginning stood out. There is, of course, much more that can be said, but I look forward to the Q&A and to Stefan's remarks.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Just two things. The first is how important it is to have this empirical data, because it really gives an idea of what is happening in very concrete terms, and not just, it allows us to step out of the commentariat. So thank you very much for this. And secondly, we're seeing a Europe which is aiming to lift its gaze somewhat, a bit more globally, but is still very much bound by pressing issues at home. Let's see how this will change with the coronavirus pandemic. Stefan, I'd like to pass the floor to you now.
Thank you, Rosa. Good afternoon to everyone. I'll tell you what I found most shocking and most interesting about the data that we saw. It's the level of continuity between the two periods. As Francesco has explained, we had two sets of indicators. One, measure the attention of the EU to particular places in the world. In this area, as he has said, there are interesting shifts away from the neighborhood, greater attention to Africa, for instance. But when it comes to the other set of data, that indicators of concrete operational engagement, such as aid, trade, operations, this sort of thing, you see enormous continuity. A little bit fewer operations, little bit more aid, but by and large, nothing much has changed. Now, why is that surprising? I think it's surprising because in the last few years, everything's changed. There are fundamental changes in the international system with huge implications on Europe. But if you look at our data, nothing much changed. The EU business as usual continued. And I think this actually says a lot about the EU foreign policy. It's a bit like the story from Sherlock Holmes about the dog that didn't bark. It's a clear indication on how frozen to some extent the European foreign policy system is. Now, our two articles cover basically the entire period of the implementation of the Lisbon Treaty. And I think it's useful probably to say a few words about how I see the evolution of CFSP on that basis. I think what needs to be said, of course, is that the implementation of the Lisbon Treaty took place against the background of a very deep crisis, the financial crisis. And the way it was implemented did not live up to the potential of the treaty. It was done at a time when the EU had very little money, very little self-confidence, was under big strain, was distracted. And therefore things were done not in the best possible way. I think the way the EES has been set up, I think leaves much to be desired. But I think it's only fair to say that the Lisbon reforms brought significant improvements. I think one is obvious, is the much greater continuity. You have the High Representative and the President of the European Council replacing the functions of the rotating presidency. And that, of course, allows much more continuity in the policies. Another huge step forward, I think, is to give the EU delegations the political role of the presidency. I think this gave the EU in many countries a much stronger face and a voice, which is really quite significant and with positive outcomes. I also believe that the double hatting of the High Representative reduced somewhat the gap between the foreign policy led by the Council and the external relations that are led by the Commission. I think now if there is some sort of a crisis from the beginning, you have not just the diplomats in the room, but you have also the experts on humanitarian aid, on trade, etc. And that is another game. But these kind of gradual steps towards greater effectiveness were outweighed and outpaced by international developments that really deteriorated the external position of the European Union. And I'll very quickly go through 5 of them. The first one, of course, I think the treaty entered into force 2009. That was about the time when the dream of the liberal world order died. Definitely. Where I remember I was working with Solana when he wrote his security strategy. And the security strategy was based somehow on the assumption that the EU, together with the US, was working towards changing the world in the direction of a liberal world order. And we were very, very confident of that happening. And the EU felt itself to be the vanguard, but also the role model for this global order. And for us, what then actually happened is the return of geopolitics, a rise of authoritarian regimes, return to power politics, which was deeply uncomfortable for the EU and a huge challenge to adjust to, and the adjustment has not still fully happened. And somehow we now became sort of a postmodern island in a sea of power politics, which fundamentally, I think, changed the situation. The second point, and I think that's very much related to the first one, is of course a change, rather fundamental change in the power constellation. I remember in the 9 years I worked with Solana, very, very few discussions of China. Basically, I mean, the fact that China was becoming more powerful economically was, I think, widely known. But on the foreign policy radar screen, China virtually did not happen, didn't exist. And of course, at that time, Russia was still largely cooperative. Turkey was trying to join the European Union. So I think what happened is the rising powers and the relative decline of EU influence changed the mindset of EU foreign policy. What used to be sort of a transformational agenda, we changed the world together with the US in our own model, basically, according to our own model, turned into something very defensive. We have to protect European interests and values against interference from outside, basically. Quite a significant change. The third one, equally important, is the weakening of the partnership with the United States. In my time with Solana, I worked on the Balkans, and I think I talked to the State Department, I think 3 or 5 times every week. Probably I talked more to the State Department than to any or most of the EU member states. De facto, the United States was a full participant in CFSP. That's just a fact of life. And this had its downsides, sometimes significant downsides. But overall, the US influence was an integrating force and to some extent an empowering force, because the EU system is in itself intrinsically risk averse. You know, this I've been talking about the small state syndrome in the Foreign Affairs Council, and there is some truth to that. And working together with the most powerful country in the world liberated the EU and somehow made us do things that we wouldn't have done otherwise. The fourth issue was a very severe one, continuing to this day, is the loss of internal cohesion. Again, I think this is the consequences of the financial and the migration crisis, sort of spillover effect into foreign policy. It is to some extent also a function of the rise of external powers that are better at playing off member states against each other. And it basically meant that the working habits or the kind of basic dynamics of the council changed. In my time, if a country was isolated, it felt very, very uncomfortable. And in the end, there was some kind of formula compromise, and everybody joined the consensus. I think nowadays, there are some countries who are very, very happy in blocking consensus and see this as a sort of triumph of their national foreign policy. Very significant change, and of course, extremely negative for the EU. It's very interesting, I think, how the different high representatives dealt with this challenge, because both Ashton and Mogherini avoided controversy. For them, the most important thing was to concentrate on things where there could be agreement among the member states. And for Ashton, she focused on just 2 issues, basically. This is the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue and the Iran nuclear file. Concentrated all her efforts on this, apart from, of course, building up the External Action Service, which was at that time clearly also a priority. Mogherini, very differently, I think she had not sort of a few issues that she prioritized, but she tried a whole lot of things that she felt were important and where she felt that the member states were not so divided. And now Josep Borrell, it's still early days, but he takes a totally different approach. He interprets his mandate as making very bold statements, far bolder statements than anything that the 27 could agree on. And I find this very refreshing personally. And I think it certainly has certain political relevance too, but ultimately it will lead to the question, for whom is he actually speaking, right? There is this kind of dilemma, how far can he get away from the actual common basis of the member states? It's a policy also not without risks, and I'm happy that he is taking this risk. Now, the fifth and last point of the kind of developments is, of course, Brexit. I mean, one doesn't have to say much about it, but the EU lost 16% of its economy. It lost one of its strongest foreign policy players. I've been told by insiders that about 80% of the intelligence, which is the basis of sanctions decisions, came from the UK. You can see what kind of loss that entails. I'm very frustrated, also not just about Brexit, but also by the fact that the Johnson government seems totally uninterested in a structured relationship with the EU in the future, because such a structured relationship could mitigate the damage. But if there is no systematic dialogue, no system of dialogue, close dialogue, the UK will, of course, remain involved in consultations in smaller groups with EU member states, but outside the EU. And that could have a further negative effect on EU foreign policy. Now, if you take all these developments together, one could have expected that there would be some kind of mobilization in the EU to cope with these new challenges. But if you look at our data in operational terms, you can't see anything, basically. The business as usual continued. However, and I think it's only fair to say that in conceptual terms, a lot has actually changed. And I point to some of these changes. The first one is that there is clearly a shift in the global strategy, but also in the review of the neighborhood policy from this transformational agenda, which was seen as ultimately unsuccessful and overly ambitious, towards an insistence on resilience and stability as the key objectives of EU engagement. That, I think, is important. And related to that, a strong emphasis on military cooperation, enhancing military cooperation. And it was funny to look at our data that in operational terms, very little happened. I think during, I don't have the figures in my mind, Francesco can help out, but I think altogether, Ashton started about 10 to 12 new operations, whereas Mogherini started 3. But in terms of initiatives to move forward on military security, a lot of things have happened. PESCO, Defense Fund, etc. And we'll see how after COVID and the financial constraints, how much of it really becomes operational, but it was a significant change. And finally, at the beginning of this institutional cycle last summer, there was a sort of a burst of foreign policy ambition. You heard the Commission President speak about the Geopolitical Commission. You had Borrell and also her talking about the need for the EU to learn the language of power. Everybody talked about European sovereignty. So altogether, suddenly there was a huge interest in doing something much more ambitious than in the past. But of course, when these people rolled up their sleeves and tried starting to work, then the COVID crisis hit us. And of course, I believe, as we wrote in the article, it's going to be a game changer. I think it's very difficult to say in which direction. I read a very interesting review in the ECFR. You might have, it's based on the survey in 9 European countries. And the findings were that many Europeans, the majority of Europeans, were deeply disappointed about the EU during the crisis. But surprisingly, 63% of the people surveyed felt that there needs to be more cooperation on the European level. And Mark Leonard wrote a piece which I found very interesting, his interpretation of why that happened. He said that basically there are globalists and nationalists. And he says the globalists are disappointed and disillusioned with globalization. And they realize the risks of globalization, of unconstrained globalization, are huge. And they are much more sort of cautious now. And the nationalists, he feels that they do understand now that the state by itself is unable to cope with the pandemic. And he feels now on both sides, they are sort of converging to and creating a new space for enhanced European cooperation. Now, I buy the first part of the argument entirely. I think the disillusionment of globalists is very real, and probably a real turn towards Europe as a need to reinforce European cooperation. I don't buy the second part at all, frankly, because I think what the COVID crisis means, and that is very relevant also for foreign policy, is a reassertion of the nation state, of the state. And it continues to today with its sort of daily, basically uncoordinated decisions on where people can go on holidays, which borders will be closed, who can in, who can go out. I think this triumph of the nation state is really felt by most nationalists as confirming that point. And I've yet to meet a single nationalist who has been converted to a pro-European as a result of this crisis. So I think it's too early to come to any conclusions, but I'll be very interested also what Anu feels about it. But I would say two final points. The first one is, for me, it's very clear that the future of EU foreign policy depends on what happens in the core areas of European integration. It's always been, to some extent, a secondary, a peripheral concern of the EU. So I would think if later this week the leaders come up with a decision on a good recovery program that is effectively implemented and actually helps pull the EU out of this crisis, this will, in the longer term, also have a very positive impact on foreign policy. I think there will be more, some of the divisions will be reduced, and there will be more confidence also dealing with the external agenda. But if that doesn't happen, if the economic crisis deepens, if there is a big second wave, I think the EU foreign policy will be part of the collateral damage. So these things are obviously very closely linked. The second final point is, I believe that the classical foreign policy, the kind of diplomatic part of foreign policy, will always be the weakest link of external policies of the EU. I think there are here structural constraints, the unanimity principle and the parallelism between national foreign policy and EU foreign policies that cannot be eliminated. They will be with us for quite a long time. But the lucky thing is that the biggest challenges the EU faces for the future are not in this area. I think what Europe amounts to in the year 2050 will depend by how we manage climate change, how we deal with the demographic challenge, the migration issue, and whether Europe in some way catches up on high technology with China and the United States. And in these areas, the EU already has quite significant and effective policies and instruments. And here the big question is there the leadership, the political will, and the cohesion of the member states to actually deploy them in an effective way? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And actually, your final point is a perfect introduction to Anu, whose book on the Brussels effect is focusing specifically really on how the EU is actually a rule setter and a rule exporter in a wide range of fields. So even if the transformative ambition was abandoned in the years following perhaps 9/11, you set it in 2009. Stefan, we can talk about this. But nonetheless, on other areas such as trade and even digital regulation, the EU actually does have global power. So that's the perfect cue. I have plenty of questions for both of you, but I'll keep them. I'll give Anu the floor, and then perhaps I can ask you some questions later when we start with the Q&A. So Anu, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rosa. So this is a fascinating study, and I really want to congratulate for putting all those numbers together. So what I thought I would do is that I offer a few thoughts on the study that you did, and then maybe talk a little bit about the EU's geopolitical role as I perceive it, and then maybe offer a few words on what the future of the EU's role internationally will look like in the post-COVID world, because as you said, it is a game changer and we all need to think about what the future role will then be. So in the paper, it also was striking to me how much continuity we were seeing, even though we see a dramatically changing world. So does it tell that the EU is unable to adjust? It is not as nimble in rethinking its foreign policy? Or does it mean that the EU is not setting its foreign policy in response to the external environment? So in many ways, you could think about when you look at these numbers, whether any change or continuity is driven by internal or external factors. So is the EU a strategic architect of its own foreign policy that decides, like when President Obama said, now we are going to pursue a pivot to Asia, which was very unsettling for the Europeans, and it was just a recognition of how the balance of power is shifting and Asia is becoming more important. But in many ways, we see examples of how the EU is shifting its resources and attention in response to external events as well. So you mentioned, for instance, the Arab Spring and how that really brought the region, the Middle East, North Africa, into the foreign policy focus. The same thing I would say with respect to the large number of trade agreements that the EU has negotiated. That in many ways, it was an opportunity that opened up when the US took a backseat, when the WTO became increasingly dysfunctional, and when the US, for instance, decided to pursue a protectionist policy. So that really gave an opening, and I think the EU decided to ramp up its trade agenda much more than the initial plan of the Commission was when it started off its term. So there are a couple of changes, even though I agree that continuity is the term that stands out, but there are a couple of changes that you identify. And one of them is a shift, a slight shift, but a shift regardless from regional to more global outlook. And the other one is a shift towards Africa. And you mentioned you attribute this shift to more global engagement to Federica Mogherini's more global outlook. And I think that might be a factor, but I think the other factor has been the increasingly difficult multilateral engagement, the decline in international institutions, and the reduction of the opportunities for the EU to shape the global environment through these multilateral channels. So the EU has had to engage in more bilateral cooperation on that front. The second, the slight pivot to Africa, and I think you correctly attribute that to the migration crisis. But I also would think that China's increasingly assertive engagement in trying to exert influence in Africa through Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, has given the EU an impetus to shift resources and make sure that it remains strongly engaged with nations in Africa. So those are a couple of thoughts on the change and continuity. In general, when I really want to applaud your focus on the data and the massive collection of empirical results that you put together, I think there are a couple of questions that I would have about the data, and maybe you want to weigh in on that. So when you, for instance, measure the visits, I was wondering, do we see the visits more in good times or bad times? Is it a sign of who are our allies, or are we rather managing the difficult relationships with certain parties where the foreign engagement stems not from opportunities, but from challenges? So for instance, when you mentioned that the United States, the strong relationship is shown in the data, is it just because it actually needs now more maintenance because it is less straightforward? Also, when you talk about declarations and conclusions, and you showed the slide showing that the main topics have been migration, Ukraine, Syria, Libya, it makes one wonder whether these conclusions and declarations are effective. How much is the EU actually affecting change in the policies on the ground? Or is it that our audience with these declarations and statements are not really even foreign governments? The goal is not even to change practices, but rather to communicate the values to domestic and broader international audiences alike. And an idea perhaps for future data gathering when you focus on diplomacy, I'd be curious if you had looked at the social media type of channel in terms of using it as a vehicle for diplomacy. So we talk a lot about China's COVID diplomacy and how much some information wars were fought in the online environment, and whether the EU has engaged and should engage more forcefully to try to counter some of those diplomatic wars that are fought online today. So those were a couple of my thoughts on the paper itself, but let me now offer a few thoughts on the EU's broader geopolitical role. And I was particularly excited to see you broaden the conversation on geopolitics beyond hard politics and geopolitics more narrowly defined. But I think it's also a perfect opportunity for us to try to think what the geopolitical role in the EU context would even mean. And when it comes to more assertive foreign policy, I think there are very few tools that the EU has to be an assertive power. And I can think of 3 areas where I think the EU might be moving towards a more controversial stand against the interests of the United States, against the interest of China and many other countries, but where it potentially has the ability to leave its mark and affect the change. One is the idea of trying to pursue climate change mitigation through carbon tariff. There is a WTO consistent way, potentially, if correctly drafted, to impose the carbon tariff, and it's something that clearly the Commission has indicated as a policy priority. The other assertive policy, not at the EU level, but coming from the individual member states, so still very Europe-driven, is the digital tax. Another controversial policy tool, but something that might be a fight that is worth fighting, or at least a way to use the European nations' unilateral threat of imposing this digital tax as a way to then stimulate the global negotiations in this domain. And the third area of shifting assertiveness is the regulatory scrutiny of the state-backed foreign acquisitions. And that is something where we now see the EU rethink its state aid rules, for instance, and thinking about its competition policy in more strategic and assertive terms. But beyond those few areas where I believe that the EU is already acting at the outer limits of what it can do with its powers, I think there's less than the EU can do. But that doesn't mean that the EU is not relevant or EU could not be powerful. And that brings me then to the argument that I have been advancing in the book that I wrote that Rosa mentioned, is that the EU has a unique role globally in being very influential through its law, through the regulations that it sets for the European market. And that is what I call the Brussels effect. So this idea that the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So these companies follow the EU rules, whether we talk about competition law, data protection, environmental protection, chemical regulation, food safety, you name it. The EU sets those stringent rules, but the companies adopt those rules as the price for entering the large lucrative market. But these companies not only apply these rules with respect to their business in the EU, but they often extend them across their global production and global operations, because they prefer uniform rules and they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regimes. So often it is big multinational companies that are transporting the EU rules across the global marketplace. It is a very passive way and very near costless way for the EU to exert global influence. All it needs to do is to regulate the single market, and it is the global companies that do the rest. And one question is whether this kind of power actually matters. And I would argue that it does. It really affects each and every one of us every day. It affects the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the products we produce and consume. So it is really the kind of power that we see deployed either to the benefit of those who criticize, to the detriment of people around the world. So trying to convert this kind of passive regulatory power in a very assertive tool of geopolitical power is untested and potentially unwise. And my fear is that it might undermine the very power that the EU has and has very effectively been able to leverage over the years. So let me now end my comments very briefly with what I see coming in the world of COVID. And as an academic, I don't think my comparative advantage is in speculation and prediction, but I think there are a couple of ways that we might want to think about how the EU's power that it has today will not be necessarily weakened by COVID. So first of all, when I talk about the Brussels effect, when I talk about the regulatory power, it is technocratic power. And this technocratic nature of the power also insulates it often from economic and political crises. So if you think about the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, it was not sidelined because of the migration crisis. It was not sidelined because of the Brexit vote, because the civil servants will go to their desk and work on the agenda that is assigned to them. And right now they are working on, for instance, the Digital Services Act. And the major turmoil politically and economically that the EU's political leaders are facing with does not shift their priorities as much. And second, I think we can see from the past crises that the EU tends to grow its powers through the crisis. That happened with the Euro crisis when we've been strengthening the financial architecture of the EU. It happened to some extent already with the migration crisis. And I would not be completely surprised if, for instance, post-COVID, the EU would gain more powers in areas like public health, or as we now seeing, potentially agreeing to the rescue fund and take a step towards deeper financial integration. And let me end with the final comment of why I think that this may actually lead to the greater reliance and on the single market and reigniting really that core of the European project. So what we may see as a result of this pandemic is a further declining globalization. But I don't think the answer will be deglobalization. Yes, we will be seeing the strengthening of nation state, like Stefan was saying, but we also see a shift towards regionalization. The countries cannot start sourcing and producing and selling locally, and they need still a diversity in their supply chains. And as the trust in global supply chains will evaporate and has evaporated, we may see an increasing reliance on the single market. The single market still provides diversity and scale and reliability. And we might see many European companies and European nations to build a post-COVID recovery plan on a strong single market. So my hope is that COVID will give the impetus to really build on the existing strength that the EU has, allowing the EU even more effectively to deploy the power and the greatest assets that it has.
Thank you very much, Anu. And I liked your point about technocracy. I think this past decade of crisis has seen a bit of a struggle between technocracy and nationalism, which is unresolved. It's still ongoing. And I think the way in which the EU will manage to rebalance that relationship will actually determine the shape of European politics to come. And also your point about basically it's down to the single market. And I think with the coronavirus pandemic, and when all of a sudden the borders were closed to people, not to goods, but I think that sort of suddenly put the spotlight on something that Europeans are actually taking for granted, the existence of the single market. And I wouldn't be surprised if the institutions started to communicate a bit more boldly about why the single market has benefited Europeans and the European economy so much. So I think that's a very interesting point. Now, I have a question myself, and then we've also have some questions coming in. So let me throw both and we only have 10 minutes to go. So let me throw them both at you. The first question is actually mostly to Francesco and Stefan about this puzzle about the continuity, despite the fact that there are actually some conceptual changes and obviously major challenges. And I'm just wondering whether the nature of the EU tools and the way they are laboriously negotiated between the various institutions with the member states, whether they create some path dependency from which it's very difficult to step back and change. So, you know, the EU spends a certain amounts of money towards its partners. When suddenly there's a crisis, the EU picks up on unspent money to address that crisis, but it never really, unless there are different specific circumstances in the country concerned, they never really modifies the overheads, shall we say, the sort of overall amounts of money that the EU spends on that country, because having reached that agreement is so laborious, you don't actually want to go into that process. So that whether there's a bit of a path dependency between past and present that undermines the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. So that's my question for Francesco and for Stefan. And then I will also bring to you a question that comes from a couple of our viewers about, and they all refer to EU Africa. So the fact that the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's first trip was to Addis Ababa, to the African Union, and what does that tell us? But also what to expect from EU-Africa relations in this new context of the pandemic. And I'd like to add to that, because last week we had the fortune of hosting a global event with the High Representative Josep Borrell, and he too emphasized EU-Africa, not just in terms of a new prioritization for Europe, which had been on the cards, but also in terms of what Anna was referring to, diversification of supply chains and focusing a little bit more. And I kind of have this vision, instead of, the West, US, EU, China, it's actually a long slice of the globe rather than the top slice of the globe, where there is far greater an effort to seek greater economic integration also with Africa. So shall we just start with these questions? It's quite a bit that I've put on your plate. And then we'll see. We only have a few minutes left, so I think we're going to have to be focused. Who would like to take first stab? Francesco? Yeah, okay, let's start. So let's go in the same order. Francesco, then Stefan, and then Anu.
Well, great questions. One thing that resonated, Rosa, when you were raising your first point was some of the numbers that came up when we looked at the CSCP missions and the way in which, as Stefan said, under the term of Federica Mogherini, just 3 missions were initiated against 9 which were initiated under Ashton. But I think that the relevant data there was that the total staff, the number of missions remained roughly the same. It was 19 versus 17, I think. But the number of staffing, like the volume of the staffing was increased, very smaller. They under Ashton, they had 6,000 people deployed versus 5,000 under Mogherini. And what we're seeing as a priority for the German presidency, and Borrell has been speaking about this a lot, is this new European peace facility, which would supposedly address part of problems that relates to funding of these CSDP missions. To create, as you said, go work on the overhead instead of emptying some budget pockets that in which there are some funds left. So that's definitely one point that it's worth raising. If I may, I could also address very quickly one of the points that Anu made about the visits are a sign of a good or bad times. And here, I was just quickly looking up some numbers. I think the truth lies in the middle there, because you have the top countries that received the least visits. If you go and see at the difference between the two periods, are Russia with -16, then Israel with -14, Israel, Palestine, like we counted it as one, which is probably some disengagement from the peace process, and then Egypt under the rise of General Sisi. China remained the same, 10 and 10, and Canada, Japan, and the US saw an increase. So in Canada, it's probably related to the negotiations of the trade deal, and for the US, the same, plus, as you rightly said, some high-level maintenance that needed to be done to maintain the relation. And then I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Stefan.
Thanks. On your question of past dependency and whether that explains the continuity between external engagement, I think to some extent it does. Basically, external relations has different strands, trade, aid, etc., etc., etc. And these strengths develop very independently. They're driven by interests of member states, by powerful lobbies, by the Commission's priorities, but basically they are not really connected to each other. To some extent, that's quite positive because it protects them against disruptions. I think Anu made this point. At the same time, of course, you can't do geopolitics with it. If you have other players like China or the US that very strategically use the various instruments together to achieve a common goal, that's beyond the reach of the EU because it's too disjointed. And I think you would need a great deal more leadership and a great deal more strategic outlook to bring these various strands together and actually use them as part of one comprehensive policy. On Africa, I was very much struck by something that Mr. Borrell said in your talk last week, is that in the year 2070, Africa will have 22% of the world population and Europe will have 3.5%. And I think that says a lot already. Of course, many of these demographic projections are a bit dodgy, ultimately self-preventing prophecies to some extent. But I think the simple truth is that the next 10, 20 years, you will have, on the one hand, the US-China competition as an axis of international developments. And on the other hand, you will have Africa as an incredibly fast-growing issue on the world stage. And of course, between the US and China, Europe is much better positioned to engage constructively with China. We are more exposed to problems coming from that direction, but we are also much better positioned to benefit from cooperation with potentially incredibly powerful a new player on the international scene. So I think I've always felt very strongly that for a long time Europe totally neglected Africa because somehow the former colonial powers, the UK and France, wanted to do a lot of these things by themselves and were not too keen of having really concrete EU engagement there.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Anu, the final words are for you.
So very briefly on Africa, since the questions focused on that, I think it is of tremendous importance, both in terms of challenges and opportunities. And I think the study would hopefully show that we see continuity in terms of increasing engagement in addressing both of those challenges and opportunities. And I mentioned two. So one, I had a lot of examples of how Brussels effect has been converting the regulations in the African continent to mirror many of those in the EU. The EU is such an important export destination, so very few African companies afford to deviate from those regulations. But that certainly shouldn't give the EU a narrative of complacency. A lot of our relations in Africa require very active management as opposed to relying on the markets doing the work for the EU. And again, I would go back to what China is doing. In many areas, China has been very successful in aggressively exporting its surveillance technologies, infringing privacy, and very much deviating from the kind of values that drive the digital agenda in the EU. And there, Africa is one of those battlegrounds where the EU would need to provide an alternative to counter, maybe together with the United States, because that's where the interests are aligned to these efforts by the Chinese to export the surveillance, especially to authoritarian regimes. And the other one, I would go back to migration. And in the post-COVID world, we are dealing with public health challenges. We are dealing with economic challenges. And if you imagine these two combined, in the continent like Africa that doesn't have the resources that the EU, even with the resources, is struggling to deal with the crisis, it will evolve into further pressures to migrate and the new migration crisis. So this will be at the heart and center of the EU's foreign policy agenda in not too long. And I hope that this time the EU would be ahead of it and better prepared and able to handle it differently than it did when it was particularly ill-prepared when the last wave of migration crisis hit the EU.
Thank you very much. This was really a very interesting discussion. I'm so glad that we were able to do this just before the summer. I'd like to thank Francesco and Stefan, our authors, for being here, but I'd also like to thank Anu. I think this is perhaps your first engagement with Carnegie as a non-resident fellow, so I'm delighted that it was with us on this special topic, and I look forward to more engagements with you. Let me also just allow me to thank also obviously our audience and for the questions, but also allow me to thank Emma Murphy, who's running all these online events that we've been organizing since we've been relegated home, and also to our comms team for helping out and for the tweeting. So thank you all. These are the invisible parts of Carnegie, but they really do shoulder a lot of the work. And yes, I wish you all a nice rest of the day and week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.